I stood frozen in my parents' living room, staring at the legal documents spread across the antique coffee table. My brother James smiled triumphantly while my parents beamed with pride. "We're signing over Oakridge to James," my father announced. "It's time the estate passed to the next generation." What they didn't know was that my grandfather had created a hidden trust 20 years ago, naming me as the sole trustee with complete legal authority over the property. I had spent the last decade secretly paying the estate's mounting debts while they played favorites. Now, as they attempted to give away what wasn't legally theirs to give, I faced an impossible choice between revealing the truth or walking away from my birthright forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to Sunday dinner at Oakridge arrived via text from my mother. "Darling, please join us this weekend. Your father and..." I have exciting news to share. James and Catherine will be here too. I had no reason to suspect anything unusual. These family gatherings had been a monthly tradition since I moved to the city 8 years ago, though they had grown increasingly tense as the divide between how my parents treated James and me widened into an unbridgeable chasm. I pulled my car through the wrought iron gates of Oakridge Estate, navigating the long, winding driveway lined with century-old oak trees that gave the property its name. The 3-story Victorian home appeared on the horizon, its stone facade and distinctive turret just as impressive as when my ancestors built it in 1887. 5 generations of Harringtons had lived, loved, and died within these walls. Though I now lived in my downtown apartment 40 minutes away, Oakridge remained the only place that truly felt like home. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I parked beside James's gleaming new Range Rover. Another gift from our parents, no doubt. My modest sedan looked painfully out of place by comparison. I gathered the bottle of wine I'd brought and made my way to the front entrance, my finger hovering momentarily over the doorbell before deciding to use my key instead. Despite everything, I was still a Harrington. This was still, in some sense, my home. "Alexandra, you're here!" my mother called from the kitchen. Victoria Harrington emerged with a dish towel in hand, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She embraced me briefly, the scent of her expensive perfume enveloping me as it had throughout my childhood. "James and Catherine are in the study with your father. Dinner's almost ready." I followed the sound of laughter to find my father. Brother and sister-in-law huddled together over what appeared to be legal documents. Their conversation halted abruptly when I entered the room. "Alex," my father said, standing to greet me. Edward Harrington had always been an imposing figure, tall, distinguished, with piercing blue eyes that matched my own. At 65, he remained every bit the successful corporate attorney who had built his reputation defending the interests of families like ours. Perfect timing. We were just discussing what we wanted to tell you tonight. James looked up with that familiar expression, 1 part smugness, 2 parts condescension. At 35, 2 years my junior, he had followed our father into law and now worked at his firm, being groomed to take over when our father eventually retired. "Hey, sis. Glad you could make it." His wife Catherine offered a tight smile. We had never warmed to each other, her loyalty firmly with her husband and his interests. "Alexandra, lovely dress." Her tone suggested otherwise. Before I could respond, my mother called us to dinner. The dining room at Oakridge seated 20 comfortably. But tonight the 5 of us gathered at one end of the massive mahogany table. Crystal glassware sparkled in the light of the chandelier overhead, and the family silver, polished to perfection, flanked fine china plates bearing my mother's signature roast lamb and rosemary potatoes. The conversation remained superficial through the first course. Discussion of local politics, Catherine's charity committee work, James's latest court victory. I spoke little, answering direct questions about my work as a museum curator with minimal elaboration. 8 years in the role, having earned my doctorate in art history, and my career achievements still garnered only passing interest from my family. It was during dessert, my mother's apple tart, that my father cleared his throat and exchanged a meaningful glance with my mother. "Alexandra, we wanted you here tonight because we're making some important changes regarding Oak Ridge," he began, his tone measured in the way it always was when delivering what he considered significant news. "Your mother and I have been discussing this for some time, and we've decided it's time to plan for the future." My mother reached for his hand. "We're not getting any younger, darling, and with James and Catherine planning to start a family, soon it seems the right moment to ensure the estate remains in good hands." An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I set down my dessert fork, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "We've decided to transfer ownership of Oak Ridge to James," my father continued. "The paperwork is nearly complete. We'll continue living here, of course, but the estate will legally belong to James and Catherine by the end of the month." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. Oak Ridge, my childhood home, the estate I had secretly been helping to maintain financially for the past decade, given to James without so much as a discussion with me. I don't understand," I managed, my voice steadier than I expected. "Why now? And why wasn't I consulted about this decision?" My father frowned. "Alexandra, be reasonable. James is starting a family. He's working at the firm. He'll carry on the Harrington name and legal practice. It makes sense for the family estate to pass to him." "And what about me?" I asked, the words escaping before I could stop them. James let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Come on, Alex. What would you do with a place like this? You live in that tiny apartment downtown. You work at a museum. This place needs someone who can actually maintain it properly." The irony of his statement might have been amusing if it weren't so painful. For the past 10 years, I had been quietly transferring money from my own accounts to cover Oak Ridge's mounting maintenance costs, property taxes, and staff salaries. My grandfather Harrison Harrington had established a trust before his death, naming me as trustee when I turned 21. He had always seen something in me that my parents couldn't, a deep connection to our family's heritage and a responsibility to preserve it. Grandfather had known, somehow, that my parents' financial situation wasn't as solid as they projected. Bad investments and my father's increasingly lavish lifestyle had begun to drain the family resources even before grandfather's death. The trust had been his way of ensuring Oak Ridge's survival, while giving me a connection to our legacy that no one could sever. No one in the family knew about the arrangement except for Walter Jenkins, our family's elderly estate attorney who had helped grandfather establish the trust. For a decade, I had kept the secret, watching as my parents continued to drain resources, while I quietly shored up the estate's financial foundation. I lived modestly, took few vacations, and limited my own expenses to ensure Oak Ridge remained solvent. And now they were giving it away, or attempting to. "I see," I said finally, setting my napkin beside my plate. "And this decision is final?" "We thought you'd be happy for your brother," my mother said, her expression a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "This is about securing the Harrington legacy." I looked around the table, at my father's stern certainty, my mother's practiced elegance, James's poorly concealed triumph, and Catherine's calculating gaze. None of them knew that what they were attempting was legally impossible without my consent. The property they thought was theirs to give had been secretly protected by my grandfather's foresight. I had a choice to make: reveal the truth about the trust and my years of financial support, or remain silent and let them proceed with a transfer that would ultimately fail when Walter Jenkins was forced to disclose the trust's existence. "May I see the paperwork?" I asked, my decision still unformed. James hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. "It's pretty standard transfer documentation. Dad's firm handled everything." I opened the folder, scanning the legal language I had become familiar with through my years managing the trust. The documents named my parents as the full owners of Oak Ridge Estate, transferring all rights and responsibilities to James Harrington and Catherine Harrington, with no mention of the Harrison Harrington Trust that actually held the property's title. Did Walter Jenkins review these documents? I asked, knowing he hadn't. Walter would have been legally obligated to disclose the trust's existence. Jenkins is practically retired, my father said dismissively. Graham at the firm handled everything. Why does it matter? I closed the folder, buying time as I considered my next move. The truth would shatter my family's perception of the past decade. It would expose my parents' financial mismanagement and force them to acknowledge how they had overlooked and undervalued me, while I saved the very legacy they now wanted to hand to James. No reason, I said finally, forcing a smile that felt brittle on my face. I was just curious about the details. My mother beamed, misinterpreting my response as acceptance. Wonderful. We'll have a proper celebration once everything is finalized. Perhaps a housewarming party for James and Catherine as the new stewards of Oak Ridge. I excused myself shortly after, claiming an early meeting the next day. As I walked to my car, under the canopy of ancient oaks, the weight of my unspoken truth pressed down on me. The estate around me, the manicured gardens, the restored carriage house, the newly shingled roof, all maintained through my silent contributions, would supposedly soon belong to my brother. But the Harrison Harrington Trust said otherwise, and sooner or later, that truth would emerge. I had until the end of the month to decide whether I would be the one to reveal it, or if I would let the legal system do it for me. As I drove away from Oak Ridge that night, watching the estate recede in my rearview mirror, I knew that whatever choice I made would permanently alter my relationship with my family. The question wasn't whether I would fight for my birthright, but how and when I would make my stand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The following morning I arrived at the Metropolitan Museum of Art earlier than usual. As senior curator of American historical artifacts, I had my own office, a small but elegant space overlooking the sculpture garden. I closed my door, set down my coffee, and pulled out my phone. It was time to call Walter Jenkins. Walter had been the Harrington family attorney for over 40 years. At 78, he had scaled back his practice considerably, but maintained a handful of long-standing clients and trusts, including my grandfather's. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the distinctive gravelly quality that years of expensive Scotch had cultivated. Alexandra Harrington, to what do I owe this pleasure? Good morning, Walter. Do you have time to meet today? Something's come up regarding grandfather's trust. There was a brief pause before he responded. I see. Yes, I can make time. Shall we say noon at Westfield's? Westfield's was a private club in Midtown where Walter conducted most of his business meetings, discreet, traditional, and inaccessible to most of the population. It was the perfect place to discuss sensitive family matters. I'll be there, I confirmed, already mentally reorganizing my day. I spent the morning in automatic mode, reviewing acquisition proposals and preparing for an upcoming exhibition on Revolutionary War artifacts. My assistant, Marcus, noticed my distraction, but knew better than to pry. By 11:30, I was in a taxi heading downtown, my mind racing with all the questions I needed to ask Walter. Westfield's hadn't changed in the 20 years I'd been coming here, first with my grandfather, later with Walter for trust matters. Dark mahogany paneling, oil portraits of distinguished members, and leather chairs that had witnessed decades of confidential conversations. A uniformed attendant escorted me to Walter's usual corner table, where he was already waiting, a tumbler of scotch at his elbow despite the early hour. Alexandra. He stood as I approached, taking my hand in his. You look troubled, my dear. I slid into the chair across from him, declining the waiter's offer of a drink. My parents are transferring Oak Ridge to James. Walter's bushy eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. I see. And they haven't consulted with me about this? Apparently, they're using someone named Graham at my father's firm. They said you're practically retired. Walter made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a snort. Edward always did. Prefer convenient narratives over uncomfortable truths. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Alexandra, your parents cannot legally transfer Oak Ridge to your brother. The property is held by the Harrison-Harrington Trust, with you as the sole trustee. You know this. Yes, but they don't. That was grandfather's stipulation, that the trust remain confidential unless absolutely necessary to reveal it. And now it's becoming necessary, Walter observed, taking a thoughtful sip of his scotch. I nodded, the weight of the situation settling more firmly on my shoulders. I've been making the mortgage payments and covering maintenance costs for a decade, Walter. They have no idea. They think the estate is still theirs to give away. Harrison knew what he was doing when he established that trust, Walter said. He recognized your connection to Oak Ridge and your commitment to preserving the Harrington legacy. He also recognized your parents' less prudent approach to financial matters. The waiter arrived with our lunch, a Caesar salad for me, steak for Walter. We paused our conversation until he departed. What are my options? I asked, pushing a piece of lettuce around my plate. Walter cut into his steak with surgical precision. You have several, none particularly pleasant. You could reveal the trust immediately, which would certainly halt the transfer but create considerable family discord. You could wait until the transfer process encounters the trust, at which point the attorneys involved will be legally obligated to disclose its existence. Or, he paused, looking at me directly. You could choose to dissolve the trust and allow the transfer to proceed. Dissolve it? I set down my fork. After everything I've done to maintain Oak Ridge? It is an option, though not one I would recommend. Harrison was explicit about his wishes. He wanted Oak Ridge preserved for future generations under your stewardship. I thought about the countless nights I'd stayed up reviewing the estate's finances, the vacations I'd skipped to afford property tax payments, the careful budgeting that allowed me to divert nearly a third of my salary to Oak Ridge's upkeep. I thought about my brother's new Range Rover and my mother's designer clothes, luxuries they enjoyed while I secretly kept the family legacy from bankruptcy. They'll be humiliated when they learn the truth, I said quietly. Walter's expression softened. Perhaps, or perhaps they'll finally recognize the tremendous service you've been providing all these years. We both knew which outcome was more likely. There's one more thing to consider, Walter added, reaching for his briefcase. The final stipulation in Harrison's trust. He produced a sealed envelope, slightly yellowed with age. This was to be given to you when either the trust was revealed to the family or on your 40th birthday, whichever came first. I stared at the envelope, my grandfather's distinctive handwriting visible on the front. For Alexandra, when the time comes. He left this 15 years ago, Walter explained. I've kept it in my private safe ever since. With slightly trembling fingers, I took the envelope and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery, covered in my grandfather's elegant script. My dearest Alexandra, if you're reading this, either our family has discovered your role as trustee of Oak Ridge, or you've reached your 40th birthday with the trust still intact. Either way, the time has come for you to know the complete truth. Oak Ridge has always been more than a family home. It represents our history, our values, and our responsibility to preserve something meaningful for future generations. I chose you as trustee not simply because I recognized your love for our heritage, but because I saw in you a strength of character that our family desperately needs. Your parents and your brother possess many admirable qualities, but they lack the vision to see beyond immediate gratification. This isn't entirely their fault. Our privilege has shielded them from developing the wisdom that comes from genuine struggle and sacrifice. The final provision of the trust, which Walter will explain in legal terms, gives you complete authority to determine Oak Ridge's ultimate fate. You may maintain it within the trust, transfer it to family members of your choosing, or convert it to a historical foundation that ensures its preservation in perpetuity. Whatever you decide, know that my faith in you has never wavered. Your compassion, integrity, and quiet determination will guide you to the right choice, not just for the property, but for our family's true legacy. With love and complete confidence, Grandfather Harrison. I looked up from the letter to find Walter watching me with a gentle expression. He knew this day would come, I said, carefully refolding the letter. Harrison was many things, but never naive about human nature, Walter agreed. The trust gives you complete legal authority over Oak Ridge. Your parents' attempt to transfer the property will inevitably fail once the title search reveals the trust's existence. How long do I have before that happens? Given the complexity of the estate and your father's notorious impatience with details, I'd estimate 2 weeks at most before their attorneys discover the obstacle. 2 weeks to decide how to handle a revelation that would permanently alter my family dynamics. 2 weeks to determine whether to assert my legal rights or find another solution that might preserve some semblance of family harmony. Thank you, Walter, I said, tucking my grandfather's letter into my purse. I need time to think. Of course. He signaled for the check. But Alexandra, remember one thing. Harrison didn't create this trust merely to preserve a building. He did it to preserve values he saw in you that he feared were fading from the rest of the family. Whatever you decide about Oak Ridge, don't lose sight of what your grandfather was truly trying to protect. As I left Westfields and walked into the bright afternoon sunlight, my phone chimed with a text from James. Mom wants to know if you're coming to dinner this Sunday to discuss renovation plans for the East Wing. Catherine has some ideas. The audacity was so typical of my family that I almost laughed. They were already planning changes to a property they didn't legally own, inviting me to witness my own displacement from the home I had secretly maintained for years. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I changed direction and headed toward Central Park, finding a bench near the lake where I could sit and gather my thoughts. The spring air carried the scent of new beginnings, a fitting backdrop for the decision before me. For 10 years, I had silently shouldered the burden of preserving Oak Ridge, finding a strange satisfaction in being the secret guardian of my family's legacy. There had been a certain power in knowing something my parents and brother didn't, that without my intervention, the estate they took for granted would have been lost years ago. But that secret had also kept me locked in a pattern of martyrdom and resentment. I had enabled my family's illusions about their financial security while quietly seething at their lack of appreciation for my sacrifices. Perhaps Grandfather had foreseen this too, that the secrecy he initially mandated would eventually become unsustainable, forcing a reckoning that would either break our family apart or forge a more honest relationship among us. As the afternoon light began to fade, I finally answered James's text. I'll be there. We have a lot to discuss about Oak Ridge's future. Whatever path I chose, the days of silence and secret keeping were coming to an end. The truth about Oak Ridge and my role in its preservation would soon emerge. The only question remaining was whether I would control that revelation or allow it to control me. Sunday arrived with ominous gray clouds hanging over the city, matching my mood as I drove toward Oak Ridge. I had spent the week oscillating between righteous anger and reluctant compassion, between revealing everything immediately and finding a more measured approach that might preserve some family harmony. Grandfather's letter remained in my purse, its presence a constant reminder of the responsibility he had entrusted to me, not just for the property, but for the values it represented. As I turned onto the estate's long driveway, I noticed additional cars parked near the entrance, a silver Mercedes I recognized as belonging to Catherine's parents, and a black BMW that likely belonged to Graham. the attorney handling the property transfer. So this wasn't just a family dinner to discuss renovations. They were moving forward aggressively with their plans. I parked beside the garage rather than in the main circular drive, a small act of rebellion. This had been my parking spot throughout, high school and college, the place where my first car, a used Honda gifted by Grandfather Harrison on my 16th birthday, had always sat. James's vehicles had always occupied the prime position near the front entrance, another subtle reinforcement of the family hierarchy. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I approached the house, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. I hadn't bothered bringing an umbrella, and by the time I reached the front door, my hair was damp, and my carefully selected outfit, a navy blue dress that projected both confidence and professionalism, was speckled with raindrops. The door opened before I could use my key, revealing Catherine in a cream-colored ensemble that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Alexandra, everyone's in the drawing room." She gave my appearance a quick, dismissive assessment. "Would you like a towel for your hair?" "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, stepping past her into the foyer. The familiar scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers greeted me, the work of Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper whose salary I had been paying for 7 years without anyone's knowledge. Voices drifted from the drawing room, my father's authoritative tone, my mother's social laugh, the deeper rumble of unfamiliar male voices. I straightened my shoulders, touched the outline of my grandfather's letter in my purse for reassurance, and walked toward the sound. The drawing room at Oak Ridge was designed to impress, with its soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and antique furnishings that had been in the family for generations. I had personally arranged for the restoration of the original William Morris wallpaper 3 years earlier, a painstaking process that had cost nearly $30,000, all from my personal funds through the trust. 6 people turned to look at me as I entered. My parents, James and Catherine, an older couple I recognized as Catherine's parents, the Prestons, and a young man in his early 30s wearing an expensive suit that screamed corporate law. "Alexandra, finally," my mother said, rising to greet me. "You remember Richard and Diana Preston, Catherine's parents? And this is Graham Sutton from your father's firm. He's handling the Oak Ridge transfer." I shook hands with each of them, noting Graham's firm grip and assessing gaze. He was exactly the type my father favored. Ambitious, polished, and utterly convinced of his own competence. "Sorry I'm a bit damp," I said, taking the only remaining seat, a straight-backed chair slightly removed from the intimate grouping of sofas where everyone else sat. "I got caught in the rain." "We were just discussing the timeline for finalizing the transfer," my father explained, his tone making it clear that my tardiness had delayed important business. "Graham believes we can complete everything by next Friday." Next Friday. My conversation with Walter had suggested we had 2 weeks before the trust was discovered, but it seemed my father's influence was accelerating the process. "That's faster than I expected," I managed, accepting a glass of wine from my mother. Graham smiled confidently. "We've expedited the title search and preliminary paperwork. Barring any unforeseen complications, the property will be officially transferred to James and Catherine by the end of next week." The irony of his statement, "barring any unforeseen complications," nearly made me laugh. The Harrison-Harrington Trust was exactly the type of complication that would bring their entire plan crashing down. "And then we can begin the renovations," Catherine added excitedly. "We're thinking of converting the East Wing into a modern suite, home office for James, expanded closets, a nursery for the future." She exchanged a meaningful glance with my brother. "You're pregnant?" my mother gasped. Catherine's smile turned coy. "Not yet, but we're planning. Once the estate is officially ours, we'll start trying right away. We want our children to grow up at Oak Ridge, just as James did." "Just as we both did," I thought silently. though my experiences at Oak Ridge had been markedly different from my brother's. Where James had been given freedom to treat the estate as his personal kingdom, I had been taught from an early age about responsibility, preservation, and respecting the home's historical significance. Grandfather Harrison had been my primary teacher in this regard, spending countless hours with me in the library, explaining the stories behind each artifact and heirloom. "That's wonderful news," Richard Preston boomed, raising his glass. "To the next generation of Harringtons at Oak Ridge." Everyone clinked glasses enthusiastically while I took a small sip, mind racing. I had anticipated a planning dinner, not a celebration of what they all considered a done deal. The momentum of their certainty was almost overwhelming. "Alexandra," my mother said, breaking into my thoughts, "you've been so quiet. Don't you have anything to say about your brother's exciting news?" All eyes turned to me expectantly. This was my opening, the perfect moment to reveal everything, to watch their celebratory mood collapse under the weight of the truth. I could almost taste the satisfaction it would bring. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Congratulations, James and Catherine. Children will certainly bring new life to Oak Ridge." My father nodded approvingly at my diplomatic response, clearly relieved I wasn't causing a scene. If only he knew what I was holding back. "Well then," my mother announced, rising from her seat, "shall we move to the dining room? Mrs. Winters has prepared a special meal for the occasion." As everyone filed out, Graham Sutton fell into step beside me. "Your family mentioned you work in art preservation," he said conversationally. "That must be fascinating." "I'm a curator at the Metropolitan Museum," I corrected, "specializing in American historical artifacts." "Impressive," he nodded. "That expertise must give you a unique appreciation for a property like Oak Ridge. Such history in these walls." "You have no idea?" I said, unable to keep a hint of irony from my voice. Graham studied me for a moment. "Ms. Harrington, Alexandra, if I may, you don't seem entirely enthusiastic about this transfer. Is there something concerning you about the process?" His perception was sharper than I'd given him credit for. "I'm simply surprised by how quickly everything is moving," I replied carefully. "Oak Ridge has been in our family for 5 generations. That's a significant legacy to transfer. I assure you we're handling everything with appropriate diligence," he said as we entered the dining room. "The property history, title search, outstanding liens or encumbrances, we're examining everything thoroughly." The mention of the title search sent a jolt through me. That was exactly how the trust would be discovered, when Graham or someone at his firm inevitably found the Harrison-Harrington Trust listed as the legal owner of Oak Ridge. "And have you found anything unusual so far?" I asked, trying to sound casual as we took our seats at the dining table. Graham smiled confidently. "Nothing that would impede the transfer. The property has remarkably clean title for its age." Either he was lying to appear competent, or the title search wasn't as far along as he claimed. Either way, the clock was ticking more quickly than I had anticipated. Dinner proceeded with excruciating slowness. Course after course emerged from the kitchen as my parents, the Prestons, and James and Catherine discussed Oak Ridge's future as if it were already decided. They talked about renovations to the East Wing, modernizing the kitchen, expanding the master suite, and potentially adding a pool house near the old gardens. "Of course, we'll preserve the historical character," James assured everyone, as if this demonstrated his great respect for heritage. "The exterior will remain untouched. It's mainly the interior spaces that need updating." I pushed my food around my plate, remembering the painstaking work I had commissioned 3 years earlier to restore the original moldings throughout the house, another expense I had covered through the trust. "Alexandra restored the library? Ceiling?" my mother mentioned unexpectedly, causing me to look up in surprise. "She found old photographs showing the original paint design and had it recreated. It was quite impressive." This acknowledgement of my contribution, however small, was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't respond. "I didn't know you had an interest in restoration," Catherine said, her tone suggesting she found this odd. "There's a lot about me. This family doesn't know," I replied, the words escaping before I could reconsider. A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. "Well," my father said briskly, "the library ceiling is beautiful, and we appreciate your contribution, Alexandra. I'm sure James and Catherine will maintain all the historical elements you've helped restore." The conversation moved on, but I noticed Graham watching me with increased interest, as if reassessing something about my role in the family dynamics. As coffee and dessert were served, the discussion turned to practical matters of the transfer, paperwork to be signed, legalities to be addressed, timelines to be confirmed. My presence seemed almost forgotten until Graham turned to me directly. "Alexandra, as a family member, you'll need to sign a quitclaim deed as well, just to ensure clean title. I can have that sent to your office this week. A quitclaim deed would require me to relinquish any potential claim to Oak Ridge, an impossibility given the trust." "I'll review it when it arrives," I said non-committally. The evening finally wound down, with the Prestons departing first, followed by Graham, who shook my hand with particular interest before leaving. "I look forward to working with you on finalizing this transfer," he said meaningfully. "Family properties can be complicated." His emphasis on complicated made me wonder if he suspected something already. Perhaps the title search was further along than he had indicated at dinner. As I prepared to leave, James cornered me near the front door. "You were awfully quiet tonight, Alex. Is something bothering you?" For a brief moment, I considered unburdening myself, telling my brother everything about the trust, the decade of financial support I had provided, the truth about Oak Ridge's ownership. But the triumphant gleam in his eye stopped me. This wasn't the right moment for revelations. "Just tired," I lied. "It's been a busy week at the museum." "Well, Catherine and I appreciate you being supportive about the transfer," he said, clearly interpreting my silence as acquiescence. "Once everything's settled, you'll always have a place here, you know. This will still be your family home, too." The condescension in his offer, granting me access to a home that was legally mine through the trust, was almost too much to bear. "How generous of you," I managed, reaching for the door handle. "I should go. It's getting late." As I drove away from Oak Ridge that night, the rain had stopped, and glimpses of stars appeared between breaking clouds. The universe, it seemed, was offering a metaphor for my situation, clarity emerging after storm and darkness. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made my decision. Tomorrow morning, I would contact Walter Jenkins and set events in motion that would forever change my family's understanding of Oak Ridge and of me. Monday morning arrived with clarity that only comes after making a difficult but necessary decision. I woke before my alarm. The weight that had pressed on me for days transformed into purposeful energy. As I prepared for the day, selecting a structured charcoal suit that projected confidence and authority, I rehearsed the conversations to come. By 7:30, I was at my desk at the Metropolitan Museum, my office door closed to signal my need for privacy. I called Walter Jenkins, who answered immediately despite the early hour. "I've made my decision," I told him without preamble. "It's time to reveal the trust, but I want to control how and when the information emerges." "I expected as much." "After our last conversation," Walter replied. "What's your preferred approach?" "Not a confrontation," I said firmly. "I need documentation that clearly establishes the trust's existence and my role as trustee, but I want to present this information strategically, first to the attorney handling the transfer, then to my family in a setting where they can process it privately." Walter's approval was evident in his voice. "A measured approach. Harrison would be proud of your handling of this situation." "Can you prepare the necessary documentation today?" I'd like to meet with the attorney, Graham Sutton, as soon as possible, before he discovers the trust through the title search and informs my family without my involvement. I'll have everything ready by noon, Walter assured me. My office will contact you when the paperwork is prepared. My next call was to Graham Sutton himself. His assistant initially tried to schedule me for later in the week, but when I mentioned it concerned the Oak Ridge transfer and potential legal complications, I was connected to Graham immediately. "Alexandra Harrington," he said, his voice shifting from casual to professional. "I was planning to contact you today about the quitclaim deed." "That's partially why I'm calling," I replied. "There are aspects of the Oak Ridge situation that require immediate discussion. I'd like to meet with you today, if possible." A brief pause. "Is this something I should be concerned about?" "It's something that will significantly impact the property transfer," I said carefully. "I believe it's in everyone's best interest, including yours professionally, that we discuss this before proceeding further." To his credit, Graham recognized the seriousness in my tone. "I can meet you at 3 this afternoon. Will that work?" "Perfectly. I'll come to your office." I wanted this conversation to occur on his professional territory, where legal realities would take precedence over family dynamics. With those arrangements made, I turned my attention to my museum responsibilities, focusing on final preparations for our Revolutionary War exhibition. The familiar work centered me, a reminder that my identity extended beyond the Harrington family drama. By the time Walter's office called to inform me that the trust documentation was ready, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't for days. At 2:00, I collected the leather portfolio containing the trust documents from Walter's office. He had organized everything methodically: the original trust establishment, amendments, financial records showing my contributions over the past decade, and a comprehensive summary of the legal implications. "Remember," Walter advised as I prepared to leave, "you're not doing this to punish your family, but to establish truth and preserve your grandfather's intentions for Oak Ridge." I nodded, grateful for his perspective. "I'm trying to protect the estate and honor grandfather's wishes. Everything else is secondary." Graham Sutton's office was located in a gleaming downtown skyscraper, the headquarters of Blackwell & Associates, my father's firm, where James was now a junior partner. I had visited occasionally for family functions, but never on business of my own. As I rode the elevator to the 34th floor, I considered the irony of using my father's own firm to halt his plans. The receptionist directed me to Graham's corner office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of the city skyline. Graham rose from behind his desk as I entered, gesturing to a conference table rather than the more subordinate visitor chairs facing his desk. He was acknowledging me as a party with power, not merely a family member being consulted as a courtesy. "Alexandra," he began after we were seated, "you mentioned concerns about the Oak Ridge transfer. I'd like to understand the nature of these concerns before we proceed." I placed Walter's portfolio on the table between us. "What I'm about to share will significantly alter your understanding of the Oak Ridge situation. Before I open this, I want to make something clear. My intention is not to create problems for my family, but to ensure that legally binding arrangements concerning the estate are properly respected." Graham's expression remained professional, but I noticed a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "Of course. As the attorney handling this transfer, I have an obligation to ensure everything proceeds legally." I opened the portfolio and removed the trust documentation, sliding it across the table. 15 years ago, my grandfather Harrington established a trust that holds legal title to Oak Ridge Estate. I have been the sole trustee of this trust since I turned 21. My parents do not actually own Oak Ridge, despite their belief to the contrary. Graham's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine surprise as he began examining the documents. He flipped through the pages with increasing focus, occasionally glancing up at me with reassessment in his eyes. "This appears to be legitimate and properly executed," he said finally. "But I'm confused. The title search we've begun hasn't flagged this trust. Because the title is registered under the Harrison Harrington Trust, rather than individual names," I explained. "You would have discovered it eventually, but I wanted to bring this to your attention directly, rather than have it emerge during the process." Graham continued reviewing the documentation, pausing at the financial records. "These show regular payments from your personal accounts toward the estate's expenses, mortgage, taxes, maintenance costs." He looked up sharply. "Your parents don't know about this?" "No. My grandfather stipulated that the trust remain confidential unless circumstances required disclosure. He was concerned about my parents' financial management and wanted to ensure Oak Ridge's preservation regardless of their decisions." Graham sat back, absorbing the implications. "So the transfer your father has instructed me to execute cannot legally proceed without my approval as trustee," I finished for him. "My parents cannot transfer property they don't actually own." A complicated mixture of emotions crossed Graham's face: professional concern about the failed title search, obvious discomfort at having to deliver this news to my father, his boss's boss, and what appeared to be genuine admiration for my direct approach. "This creates a difficult situation for everyone involved," he said carefully. "I understand that. Which is why I came to you first, rather than simply waiting for the transfer to hit this roadblock. I'd like to work together on how best to communicate this to my family." Graham nodded slowly, professional respect evident in his expression. "I appreciate that consideration. This could have been much more problematic if discovered later in the process." He paused, considering. "What exactly are you hoping to achieve here, Alexandra? Do you intend to block the transfer permanently?" It was the central question. What did I actually want to happen with Oak Ridge? In the days since discovering my parents' plans, I had been so focused on the injustice of their actions that I hadn't fully articulated my own vision for the estate's future. "My primary concern is ensuring that Oak Ridge is preserved according to my grandfather's intentions," I said thoughtfully. "The trust gives me legal authority to determine the estate's future, but I'm not opposed to my brother and his family living there, provided they understand and respect the property's historical significance and the financial realities of maintaining it. In other words, you want recognition of your role and input into how the property is managed going forward," Graham summarized. "Along with acknowledgement of the financial support I've provided for the past decade," I added. "My family has been operating under misconceptions about their financial situation and Oak Ridge's ownership. Before any decisions about the estate's future can be made, those misconceptions need to be corrected." Graham reviewed the documents again, this time with a more strategic eye. "This trust gives you significant leverage. Your father will not be pleased when he learns about it." I smiled slightly. "I'm familiar with my father's reactions to having his plans disrupted." "How would you like to proceed?" Graham asked, shifting into problem-solving mode. "Would you prefer I inform your father about the trust directly, or would you like to address this with your family first?" I had given this considerable thought. "I believe it would be best coming from me, in a family setting, with you present, in your capacity as the transfer attorney. Your professional presence will help establish the legal reality of the situation and potentially moderate my parents' reactions." Graham nodded thoughtfully. "A reasonable approach. When would you like to have this meeting?" "As soon as possible. The longer we wait, the further along the transfer process goes, and the more embarrassing it becomes for everyone when it's halted." Graham checked his calendar. "I can make myself available tomorrow evening. Would you like me to arrange the meeting at your parents' home, at Oak Ridge?" "Yes," I decided. Oak Ridge is the appropriate setting for this conversation. The estate itself was, after all, the heart of the matter. As Graham made notes about the arrangement, I felt a curious sense of calm. After a decade of silent, support, and years of being undervalued by my family, I was finally taking control of the narrative. Whatever happened tomorrow evening would forever change my family dynamic, but the truth, however uncomfortable, was necessary for moving forward with integrity. "I'll contact your father and suggest a family meeting regarding the Oak Ridge transfer," Graham said, closing his notebook. "I won't mention the trust specifically. That revelation should come from you." "Thank you," I said, rising from my seat. "I appreciate your professionalism in handling this sensitive situation." Graham stood as well, extending his hand. "I must say, Alexandra, this isn't how I expected our meeting to go. You've presented a potentially contentious situation with remarkable composure." "I've had a good teacher in that regard," I replied, thinking of my grandfather. Harrison Harrington believed that how we handle difficult truths reveals more about our character than how we celebrate easy victories. As I left Graham's office and rode the elevator back to ground level, I felt a weight lifting. For the first time since learning about my parents' plans to transfer Oak Ridge, I wasn't simply reacting to events beyond my control. I had taken the initiative, choosing to reveal the truth on my own terms rather than allowing it to emerge in ways that might be even more damaging to my family. Tomorrow evening would bring confrontation, likely anger, possibly even temporary estrangement from my parents and brother. But it would also bring honesty, the first step toward whatever new relationship might be possible once the truth about Oak Ridge was acknowledged. As I stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow with a strange mixture of apprehension and relief. The secret I had carried for a decade was about to be revealed, and whatever happened next, I would face it not as the overlooked daughter, but as the trustee my grandfather had believed I could be, poised, purposeful, and prepared to protect what mattered most. Tuesday passed in a blur of anticipation. Graham had confirmed our meeting at Oak Ridge for 7 o'clock that evening, informing my parents that we needed to discuss important legal considerations regarding the property transfer. I spent the day at the museum in a state of hyper-focus, channeling my nervous energy into finalizing exhibition details with unusual efficiency. By 6:30, I was driving through Oak Ridge's gates, the trust documentation secure in my briefcase. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a deep burgundy dress that projected confidence without appearing confrontational. The color held personal significance. It was Grandfather Harrison's favorite, and wearing it felt like carrying his silent support with me. This time, I parked in the main circular drive, directly in front of the house. No more relegating myself to secondary positions. Tonight, I would occupy the central role that was rightfully mine. Graham's car arrived just as I was stepping out of mine. He looked impeccably professional in a tailored gray suit, carrying his own leather portfolio. The gravity of his expression confirmed that he understood the significance of the evening ahead. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we walked toward the entrance together. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. My mother opened the door before we could ring the bell, her smile faltering slightly when she saw Graham beside me. "Alexandra, Mr. Sutton, we weren't expecting you both to arrive together." "We had some preliminary matters to discuss," I said smoothly, stepping past her into the foyer. My father and James waited in the library, the very room whose ceiling restoration I had funded. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father stood near the fireplace, dominant posture communicating his assumption of control. James occupied Grandfather's old leather chair, another symbolic usurpation that suddenly seemed fitting for this evening of revelations. "Alexandra." My father nodded, then turned his attention to Graham. "Graham, I wasn't expecting you to bring Alexandra with you for this discussion." "Actually, Edward," Graham replied with careful professionalism, "Alexandra arranged this meeting. There are matters regarding Oak Ridge that require the family's immediate attention." Confusion flickered across my father's face. "I don't understand. The transfer paperwork is proceeding as planned, isn't it?" That's what we need to discuss, I interjected, moving to the center of the room. Perhaps we should all sit down. My mother joined us, perching on the arm of the sofa while casting concerned glances between my father and me. Catherine was notably absent, a detail that suggested James hadn't considered this meeting significant enough to include his wife. "Where's Catherine?" I asked, stalling briefly while gathering my thoughts. "She's meeting with the interior designer," James replied dismissively. "I'll fill her in later if there's anything relevant." I almost laughed at the irony. Catherine planning renovations for a home she would never legally possess, at least not in the way they had anticipated. With everyone seated, Graham looked to me, deferring the opening of our discussion. This was my revelation to make. "I asked for this meeting because there's something important about Oak Ridge that you all need to know," I began, my voice calm despite the pounding of my heart. "Something that directly impacts the property transfer you're attempting to execute." My father's expression darkened. "What are you talking about, Alexandra?" I opened my briefcase and removed the trust documentation, placing it on the coffee table between us. 15 years ago, Grandfather Harrison established a trust that holds legal title to Oak Ridge Estate. I have been the sole trustee of this trust since I turned 21. The silence that followed was absolute. My father stared at the documents as if they might disappear if he looked away. My mother's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of surprise I had seen countless times. Throughout my childhood, James leaned forward, brow furrowed in confusion and the first flickers of anger. "That's impossible," my father finally said, voice dangerously quiet. "My father would never have done something like that without informing me." "He did inform someone," I replied steadily. "Walter Jenkins handled the legal arrangements. The trust was intentionally kept confidential until circumstances necessitated its disclosure." Graham cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the documentation thoroughly, Edward. The Harrison-Harrington Trust is the legal owner of Oak Ridge. The property was transferred from your parents' names to the trust 15 years ago, with Alexandra named as trustee once she reached 21. My father's face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous. Some kind of mistake or misunderstanding?" "There's no mistake," I said, pushing the financial records toward him. "For the past 10 years, I've been paying the mortgage on Oak Ridge, covering property taxes, funding maintenance and restoration work, all through the trust, which is why you never knew." My mother gasped. "You've been paying the mortgage? But how? Why?" "Because grandfather knew the estate was financially vulnerable," I explained, keeping my voice level. "He understood that. You and Dad were struggling to maintain it even 15 years ago, and he foresaw that those challenges would only increase." James grabbed the financial records, scanning them with increasing disbelief. "This shows hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments over the years. Where did you get this kind of money?" "I lived modestly. I invested carefully. I prioritized Oak Ridge over personal luxuries," I said simply. "Everything I couldn't cover from my salary, I supplemented with the investment portfolio grandfather left in the trust." My father had begun paging through the trust document, his legal training allowing him to quickly grasp its implications. His expression shifted from disbelief to cold fury. "So you've been secretly controlling Oak Ridge while letting us believe it was still ours," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Playing us for fools all these years." "That's not how I see it," I countered. "I've been preserving our family legacy while respecting grandfather's wishes for confidentiality. The trust specified that its existence should remain private unless circumstances required disclosure. Circumstances like us giving the property to James," my mother concluded, her voice small. "Precisely," Graham confirmed. "Attempting to transfer property you don't legally own necessitated revealing the trust's existence." James slammed the financial records onto the table. "This is absurd. Dad, there must be some way to challenge this." She can't just swoop in and claim Oak Ridge is hers after we've made plans to take over the estate. It's not about claiming ownership, I corrected him. It's about acknowledging the legal reality that has existed for 15 years. Oak Ridge is held in trust, with me as the trustee responsible for ensuring its preservation. My father turned to Graham, professional mask dropping to reveal raw anger. You're my attorney. Fix this. Graham maintained his composure admirably. Edward, I'm handling the Oak Ridge transfer on behalf of the firm, but in this situation, I have an ethical obligation to recognize legitimate legal instruments. This trust is valid and binding. You cannot transfer property you don't own. So, what happens now? My mother asked, looking between Graham and me. Does this mean James and Catherine can't live at Oak Ridge after all? It was the question I had anticipated, the one that would allow me to shift from revelation to resolution. That depends, I said carefully. The trust gives me authority to determine Oak Ridge's future, but I'm not opposed to James and his family living here, under certain conditions. James laughed bitterly. Conditions? You're going to dictate terms to us about our family home? Our family home, I emphasized. Not yours exclusively. Oak Ridge belongs to the Harrington legacy, which I've been quietly protecting for a decade, while you've been building your career and planning renovations for property you don't own. What conditions? My father asked, legal mind already calculating potential compromises. I took a deep breath. This was the moment to articulate what I truly wanted, not just for Oak Ridge, but for our family's relationship moving forward. First, acknowledgement of the trust's existence and my role as trustee. No legal challenges or attempts to undermine grandfather's wishes, I began. Second, establishment of a family council to make major decisions about Oak Ridge's maintenance and preservation, with my vote carrying final authority as specified in the trust. I paused, gauging their reactions. My father's expression remained stony, but he was listening. James looked mutinous but contained. My mother simply appeared overwhelmed. Third, I continued, financial transparency. If James and Catherine wish to live at Oak Ridge, they must contribute substantially to its upkeep. No more free riding on my contributions while spending lavishly on luxury cars and vacations. How dare you? James began, but my father raised a hand to silence. Continue, Alexandra, he said tersely. Finally, respect for Oak Ridge's historical character. Any renovations or changes must be approved by the family council, with priority given to preserving the estate's architectural integrity and historical significance. My father regarded me with a new calculating expression. And if we agree to these terms? Then James and Catherine can make Oak Ridge their primary residence, I said. The trust allows for family occupation of the property while maintaining its protected status. I have no desire to exclude anyone from Oak Ridge. I simply want to ensure it receives the care and respect it deserves. And if we refuse? James challenged. I met his gaze steadily. Then I'll exercise my authority as trustee to convert Oak Ridge into a historical foundation with limited family access. Grandfather included that option in the trust as a last resort if family cooperation proved impossible. The threat hung in the air, potent but not aggressive. I wasn't seeking to punish them, only to protect what mattered. Graham stepped in diplomatically. Perhaps everyone needs time to process this information before making decisions. The transfer cannot proceed as planned, but there's clearly room for a family arrangement that respects both the trust's legal requirements and everyone's connection to Oak Ridge. My father stood abruptly. I need to speak with Walter Jenkins. If this trust truly exists as described, he has a lot of explaining to do about keeping it secret all these years. Walter was following grandfather's explicit instructions. Reminded him. His professional obligation was to his client, grandfather, not to you. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. James, we need to discuss this privately. Graham, I expect a full briefing on our legal options tomorrow morning. Graham nodded, but added carefully, I'll prepare an analysis, Edward, but I should note that the trust appears legally sound. Your options may be limited to working within its parameters rather than challenging its validity. As my father and James prepared to leave the room, my mother approached me, her expression a complex mixture of hurt and bewilderment. All these years, she said quietly, you've been carrying this responsibility alone. Why didn't you tell us you were paying for Oak Ridge? The simple question pierced through my carefully maintained composure. Would you have believed me if I had? Would you have acknowledged what that contribution meant? Or would it have been dismissed as just Alexandra being dramatic, as so many of my concerns have been throughout my life? My mother flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. We've underestimated you, she admitted softly. I've underestimated you. It was a small acknowledgement, but more than I had expected from this initial confrontation. As my parents and James left to continue their discussion elsewhere in the house, Graham gathered his documents and turned to me. You handled that. Remarkably well, he observed. Many people would have used this revelation as an opportunity for revenge rather than resolution. Revenge has never been my goal, I replied, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline was fading. I just want truth and recognition, for myself and for what Oak Ridge represents. Graham nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, I think you've achieved both tonight. The path forward won't be easy, but you've created the possibility for something better than what existed before. As I drove away from Oak Ridge that evening, the grand old house receding in my rearview mirror, I felt oddly unburdened. The secret I had carried for so long was finally in the open. The initial reaction had been predictably difficult, but beneath the anger and shock, I had glimpsed something unexpected, the first tentative opening for a more honest relationship with my family. Whatever happened next, we would face it with the truth between us, no longer obscured by secrets or assumptions. For the first time in years, I felt not just like Oak Ridge's silent guardian, but its rightful steward, openly acknowledged and impossible to ignore. The morning after the revelation at Oak Ridge arrived with unexpected quiet. I had anticipated an immediate barrage of calls and messages from my family, demands for further explanation, accusations of betrayal, perhaps even threats of legal action. Instead, my phone remained silent as I moved through my morning routine and headed to the museum. This silence was more unsettling than confrontation would have been. It suggested deliberation, planning, a calculated response being formulated, behind closed doors. My family had never been known for patience or restraint when their expectations were challenged. This uncharacteristic restraint signaled something significant was brewing. At noon, just as I was reviewing acquisition proposals, in my office, my assistant Marcus knocked at my door. There's a Walter Jenkins here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent. Walter rarely left his office these days, preferring to have clients come to him. His presence at the museum indicated something extraordinary had occurred. Send him in, I said, quickly clearing space on my desk. Walter entered slowly, his age more apparent today than I had noticed during our recent meetings. He carried his worn leather briefcase, the same one he had used for as long as I could remember, and his expression was grave. Alexandra, he said, lowering himself into the chair across from me. I've just come from a 3-hour meeting with your father and James. I thought you should know what transpired immediately, rather than waiting to hear their version. My stomach tightened. They're challenging the trust. Walter shook his head. They considered it. Your father had one of the firm's estate specialists review the documentation thoroughly, but the trust is ironclad. Harrison was meticulous in its construction, and your management of it has been exemplary. There are no grounds for challenge that would withstand legal scrutiny. Relief washed through me, quickly followed by wariness. If not a legal challenge, then what? So what did they want from you? Walter sighed. Information, primarily. Your father was displeased that I had kept the trust's existence from him all these years. I reminded him that I was bound by client confidentiality and that Harrison was my client in this matter, not Edward Harrington. I could imagine my father's reaction to that statement. He had always expected preferential treatment from everyone in his orbit, especially those with long-standing connections to the Harrington family. Once he accepted that reality, Walter continued, we moved to discussing options moving forward. Alexandra, I need to prepare you. They're not yet ready to accept your conditions as stated last night. I expected resistance, I acknowledged. What are they proposing instead? Walter opened his briefcase and removed a document. They've drafted a counterproposal. The core provisions are these. They acknowledge the trust's existence and your role as trustee, but they want the family council to have equal voting power among all members, with disputes submitted to independent arbitration rather than resolved by your unilateral authority. I considered this carefully. That undermines the fundamental purpose of the trust, to ensure decisions about Oak Ridge are guided by preservation principles, rather than convenience or passing trends. I pointed that out. Walter nodded. They've also proposed a different financial arrangement. Rather than requiring James and Catherine to contribute directly to Oak Ridge's maintenance, they suggest establishing a separate family foundation, funded primarily by your father, with James contributing annually as his career advances. This foundation would handle all Oak Ridge expenses moving forward, relieving you of that burden. The proposal was cleverly constructed to appear generous while actually diminishing my control. If a separate foundation handled Oak Ridge's finances, my decade of contributions would become merely historical rather than an ongoing demonstration of commitment. And the historical character stipulation? I asked. They've agreed to restrictions on external modifications but want greater flexibility for interior spaces, particularly in the East Wing where James and Catherine plan to live. I leaned back in my chair, processing these counterproposals. They weren't entirely unreasonable, but they represented a significant dilution of the trust's intent and my authority as trustee. There's one more thing, Alexandra, Walter said, his expression softening. Your father shared something I believe you should know. The financial pressures on your parents have been more severe than you realized. Your father made some unfortunate investment decisions several years ago that depleted much of their retirement savings. They've been living primarily on his decreased income and the diminishing value of assets that aren't tied to Oak Ridge. This revelation shifted my understanding of certain patterns I had observed: my mother's increased anxiety about expenses, my father's intensified work schedule despite his age, their growing reliance on James for certain luxuries they once provided themselves. They needed James to take over Oak Ridge because they can no longer afford to maintain it, I concluded, even with my contributions through the trust. Walter nodded. Those contributions have prevented foreclosure or forced sale, but they haven't been sufficient to fully stabilize the estate's financial situation. Your parents have been quietly covering gaps with loans and credit that are becoming increasingly untenable. This explained much about their desperation to transfer the property quickly and their shock at learning about the trust. It wasn't just about favoring James. It was about financial survival disguised as family succession planning. Why didn't they come to me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Pride, prejudice about my career choices, unwillingness to admit financial failure to the daughter they had always viewed as impractical. Your father doesn't find vulnerability easy, Walter said diplomatically, especially with you. He's always felt you judge his choices through your grandfather's lens. There was uncomfortable truth in that assessment. I had inherited more than Grandfather Harrison's eye for preservation. I had also absorbed his critical view of my father's financial decisions and priorities. "What do you think I should do?" I asked, valuing Walter's perspective as someone who had known my family for generations. Walter considered the question carefully. "Legally, you hold all the power in this situation. The trust gives you authority to reject their counterproposal entirely and enforce your original conditions. But I would suggest considering what outcome would best serve not just Oak Ridge's preservation, but the possibility of healing your family relationships." "You think I should compromise?" I said, not as an accusation but as a clarification. "I think you should negotiate from a position of strength but with an openness to solutions that address legitimate concerns on both sides," Walter replied. "Your grandfather valued Oak Ridge deeply, but he valued family harmony as well. He placed the estate in your hands because he trusted your judgment, not just about historical preservation, but about human relationships." I considered Walter's words, remembering conversations with grandfather in Oak Ridge's library. He had indeed spoken about the estate as both a physical legacy and a potential gathering point for future generations of Harringtons. His vision had never been for Oak Ridge to become a fortress of solitude or a weapon in family power struggles. "They've requested a meeting tomorrow evening," Walter continued. "All parties, including Catherine this time at Oak Ridge. They've asked me to attend as a neutral facilitator, given my connection to both the trust and the broader family history." "And Graham Sutton?" I asked. "Will not be present. Your father feels his dual role as both family attorney and transfer counsel creates conflicting interests." That was unsurprising. My father would want to minimize outside witnesses to family negotiations, particularly ones who reported to him professionally. "I'll be there," I decided. "But I'd like to bring someone as well, someone who understands historical preservation and can speak to Oak Ridge's architectural significance." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Do you have someone specific in mind?" "Dr. Eleanor Blackwood from the Historical Preservation Society. She conducted the assessment of Oak Ridge's historical value when I was arranging for the library ceiling restoration. She understands what's truly special about the estate and can provide objective expertise about preservation priorities versus areas where modernization won't compromise integrity." Walter nodded approvingly. "A wise addition. Having expert perspective might help depersonalize some of the more contentious decisions." As Walter prepared to leave, he paused at my office door. "Alexandra, regardless of how tomorrow's meeting unfolds, I want you to know that Harrison would be immensely proud of how you've handled this situation. You've shown exactly the combination of principle and pragmatism he hoped to nurture in you." After Walter departed, I remained at my desk, contemplating the complexities of the situation before me. The revelation about my parents' financial difficulties added a dimension I hadn't fully appreciated. Their attempt to transfer Oak Ridge to James wasn't simply favoritism or disregard for my connection to the estate. It was also a desperate attempt to solve mounting financial problems, while maintaining the appearance of control and prosperity. Understanding this didn't excuse their actions or justify the years of overlooking my contributions, but it provided context that might help forge a path forward. This wasn't just about asserting my rights as trustee. It was about finding a solution that preserved both Oak Ridge and the possibility of a healthier family dynamic. I spent the remainder of the afternoon drafting notes for the upcoming meeting, identifying areas where I could reasonably compromise and others where the trust's core principles must be maintained. By the time I left the museum that evening, I had developed a clear framework for negotiations, one that acknowledged my family's legitimate concerns while protecting Grandfather Harrison's vision for Oak Ridge's future. As I drove home through the city streets, I felt a curious sense of purpose. For years, I had defined myself partly through what my family didn't see in me, the value they failed to recognize, the contributions they overlooked, the strengths they dismissed. Now I had the opportunity to redefine those relationships based not on past patterns, but on the reality of who I had become, someone capable of balancing principle with compassion, authority with collaboration. Tomorrow's meeting would be challenging, possibly even more difficult than the initial revelation. But for the first time in years, I was approaching my family not from a position of silent resentment or defensive justification, but from genuine authority grounded in both legal reality and moral clarity. Whatever emerged from these negotiations, Oak Ridge would remain what my grandfather had intended, a physical manifestation of the Harrington legacy, preserved through the efforts of someone who truly understood its value. The only question now was whether that preservation would happen through renewed family collaboration or despite continued division. Wednesday evening arrived with the charged atmosphere of approaching thunderstorms. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as I drove toward Oak Ridge, mirroring the gravity of the conversation ahead. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood followed in her own vehicle, having graciously agreed to attend on short notice. As one of the region's foremost experts on historical architecture, her presence would provide crucial objective perspective on Oak Ridge's preservation requirements. I had spent the day preparing methodically. Beyond reviewing financial records and trust provisions, I had revisited old photographs of Oak Ridge throughout its history, reminding myself of the estate's evolution through 5 generations of Harringtons. This wasn't merely a property dispute, but a negotiation about familial legacy and shared heritage. As we approached the estate, I noticed all the family vehicles already parked in the circular drive. My father's Mercedes, my mother's Audi, James's Range Rover, and Walter's vintage Jaguar. Everyone had arrived early, likely to align strategies before my appearance. The power dynamics were immediately apparent in this simple detail. They viewed themselves as a united front against my position. I parked beside Walter's car and waited for Dr. Blackwood to join me before approaching the house. She was an imposing figure in her early 60s, with silver hair cut in a precise bob and penetrating gray eyes that missed no architectural detail. She carried a portfolio containing her previous assessment of Oak Ridge's historical significance. "Remember," she said as we walked toward the entrance, "the historical value of Oak Ridge isn't just in its age, but in its remarkable architectural integrity. Few estates of this period have maintained such consistent character through generations of occupation." "That's exactly why I requested your presence," I replied. "My family needs to understand that preservation isn't my personal hobby, but a legitimate cultural responsibility." Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, opened the door before we could ring the bell. Her expression betrayed nothing of the domestic drama unfolding within the house she had served for decades, but the slight nod she gave me carried unmistakable approval. She had witnessed more Harrington family dynamics than anyone. "They're waiting in the library, Miss Alexandra," she informed me. "I'll bring refreshments shortly." The choice of the library was significant. It was Grandfather Harrison's favorite room and the site of my most extensive restoration effort. The original ceiling mural depicting classical scenes from Greek mythology had been painstakingly reproduced based on historical photographs after water damage had destroyed portions of the original. The project had cost nearly $50,000, all funded through the trust. Everyone rose as Dr. Blackwood and I entered. The seating arrangement was telling. My parents and James occupied the leather sofa facing the door, presenting a unified front. Catherine sat slightly apart in a wingback chair, her expression carefully neutral. Walter stood near the fireplace, positioned as mediator rather than participant. "Thank you all for agreeing to this meeting," I began, taking control of the conversation immediately. "I've invited Dr. Eleanor Blackwood from the Historical Preservation Society to join us. She conducted Oak Ridge's historical assessment 3 years ago and can provide expert perspective on preservation requirements versus areas where modernization is appropriate." My father's expression tightened at this unexpected addition, but he managed a cordial nod toward Dr. Blackwood. "Welcome to Oak Ridge. I wasn't aware we would have outside participants in what is essentially a family discussion. Given that Oak Ridge's historical significance is central to the Trust's purpose, I thought expert input would benefit everyone, I replied smoothly. Just as you've brought legal expertise to bear on these matters. Walter stepped forward, assuming his role as facilitator. Perhaps we should begin by establishing common ground. Everyone here cares deeply about Oak Ridge's future, albeit with different priorities. Our goal tonight is to find a path forward that respects both the trust's legal provisions and the family's ongoing connection to this estate. My mother spoke, for the first time, her voice softer than usual. Alexandra, we've had time to process what you shared about the trust and your contributions over the years. While we're still adjusting to this new understanding, we want you to know that we appreciate everything you've done to maintain Oak Ridge. The acknowledgement, however tentative, was unexpected. I nodded, allowing the moment of connection before moving to the substantive discussions. Walter shared your counterproposal with me, I said, addressing the entire group. I've considered it carefully and believe we can find middle ground on several key points, while remaining true to grandfather's intentions for Oak Ridge. James leaned forward, his posture still defensive, but his tone moderated from our previous encounter. Before we get into specifics, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. You've been trustee for 10 years without telling any of us. That lack of transparency is hard to move past. It was a fair point, though complicated, by the trust's confidentiality provisions. The trust explicitly required confidentiality unless circumstances necessitated disclosure, I explained. But I acknowledge that operating in secret for so long has created complications that could have been avoided with earlier communication. This partial concession seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Catherine, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. What exactly does this mean for our plans to raise our family at Oak Ridge? That's what matters most to me in all of this. Her question cut to the heart of the practical implications, moving us from past grievances to future arrangements. That's what we're here to determine, I replied. I believe we can establish parameters that allow you and James to make Oak Ridge your home while ensuring the estate's preservation for future generations, including your children. Mrs. Winters arrived with a tray of coffee and my mother's homemade shortbread cookies, a peace offering of sorts, as these had been my favorite since childhood. The brief interruption allowed everyone a moment to collect their thoughts before diving into specifics. Once we were settled with refreshments, I outlined my position. I've reviewed your counterproposal and believe we can compromise on several points. Regarding governance, I propose a family council with weighted voting rather than equal votes or unilateral trustee authority. As trustee, I would maintain final decision-making power for major structural changes and historical elements, but interior renovations in the East Wing could proceed with simple majority approval, provided they don't affect architectural integrity. Dr. Blackwood interjected smoothly. If I may, the East Wing was substantially renovated in the 1920s and contains fewer original elements than other portions of the house. From a preservation perspective, it's the natural area for modernization, provided certain architectural features are maintained. This expert validation of what could be a reasonable compromise appeared to register with my father, who nodded thoughtfully. Regarding financial arrangements, I continued, I understand the proposal for a separate family foundation to manage Oak Ridge's expenses moving forward. I'm not opposed to this structure, provided the foundation is legally bound to prioritize preservation and maintenance over cosmetic upgrades or modernization. My father cleared his throat. Walter mentioned he informed you about our financial situation. The foundation would allow us to contribute meaningfully to Oak Ridge's upkeep, while resolving certain cash flow challenges we currently face. This oblique reference to their financial difficulties was as close to vulnerability as my father was likely to display. I acknowledged it with appropriate gravity. The foundation structure makes sense, especially if it creates sustainable funding for Oak Ridge beyond any individual's direct contributions. However, I would need to remain as a foundation board member with significant input on expenditure priorities. James began to object, but Catherine placed a restraining hand on his arm. That seems reasonable, she said, surprising everyone. Alexandra has proven her commitment to Oak Ridge through years of financial support. Her perspective on priorities should carry weight. This unexpected alliance shifted the dynamic in the room. Catherine's practical approach suggested she might become an important bridge between competing family interests. There's another aspect we should discuss, I added, turning to a topic that hadn't been addressed in the counterproposal. Recognition of my past contributions. I've invested over $500,000 in Oak Ridge's maintenance and preservation over the past decade. While I don't expect reimbursement, I do believe this commitment should be formally acknowledged in whatever arrangement we establish moving forward. My father's expression darkened slightly, but my mother spoke before he could respond. Of course it should be acknowledged. The truth is, we would have lost Oak Ridge years ago without your intervention, Alexandra. That deserves recognition, not just privately, but in whatever formal documents we create. Her candid admission seemed to catch even my father off guard. James looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict her. Walter, sensing progress, suggested we document points of agreement and continue working through remaining issues. For the next 2 hours, we methodically addressed each aspect of Oak Ridge's future governance, financial structure, and preservation requirements. Dr. Blackwood provided crucial technical input on which architectural elements required absolute preservation versus areas where thoughtful modernization could occur. By 9 o'clock, we had established a framework that, while not perfect from anyone's perspective, represented genuine compromise. The trust would remain intact with me as trustee, but a family council would provide input on major decisions. The East Wing would become James and Catherine's primary living space with significant latitude for interior renovations, while the historical public rooms would maintain their original character. A new Harrington Family Foundation would assume financial responsibility for Oak Ridge, with all adult family members serving as board members with defined voting rights. As Walter drafted preliminary notes on these agreements, Catherine approached me while the others were distracted with reviewing documents. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly, for not simply exercising your legal right to control everything. James wouldn't admit it, but we couldn't afford to maintain Oak Ridge properly on our own. This foundation structure gives us a sustainable path forward. Her candor was refreshing after years of carefully maintained family pretenses. That's what I want too, I replied. Oak Ridge deserves better than becoming a battlefield for family power struggles. She nodded thoughtfully. I misjudged you, Alexandra. I assumed your opposition to our plans came from jealousy or resentment. I understand now it was about something more important. This small moment of genuine connection felt more significant than many of the formal agreements we had just negotiated. It suggested the possibility of authentic relationship beyond the power dynamics that had dominated our interactions. As the meeting concluded, my father approached me while the others gathered their belongings. His expression remained guarded, but the naked anger of the previous encounter had subsided. Your grandfather would approve of how you've handled this, he said stiffly. Not just the preservation of Oak Ridge, but the way you've managed this revelation. You didn't use the trust as a weapon, though you could have. Coming from my father, this was extraordinary acknowledgement. I never wanted to hurt anyone, I responded. I just wanted Oak Ridge protected and my role in that protection recognized. He nodded once, sharply. We have a lot to discuss in the coming weeks as we formalize these arrangements, but I want you to know that despite my reaction to learning about the trust, I recognize the service you've provided to our family legacy. It wasn't an apology for years of overlooking my contributions or for attempting to transfer property that wasn't his to give. But it was a beginning, an opening toward a more honest relationship based on recognition rather than assumption. As Dr. Blackwood and I prepared to leave, I paused in the foyer, allowing myself a moment to absorb what had transpired. Oak Ridge stood around us, silent witness to generations of Harrington family dynamics. Its walls had absorbed celebrations and conflicts, triumphs and disappointments, secrets and revelations. Tonight, those walls had witnessed something new. The first tentative steps toward a family arrangement based not on illusion, but on truth, not on hierarchy, but on recognition of genuine contribution. The path ahead would undoubtedly include further challenges and negotiations, but the foundation had been laid for something more authentic than what had existed before. As I stepped out into the night air, the threatening storms had passed, leaving behind cleared skies with emerging stars. It seemed an appropriate metaphor for the evening's developments. Not perfect resolution, but the promise of greater clarity after necessary turbulence. The following weeks unfolded with remarkable intensity as our family negotiated the details of our agreement. Formal documents required drafting, financial structures needed establishment, and the emotional recalibration of our relationships continued beneath these practical concerns. I found myself in daily conversations with Walter, weekly meetings with family members, and regular consultations with financial advisors as we constructed the Harrington Family Foundation that would support Oak Ridge moving forward. Throughout this process, I maintained my museum responsibilities while dedicating evenings and weekends to family business. This dual focus proved unexpectedly beneficial. My professional expertise in historical preservation providing valuable perspective for Oak Ridge decisions, while the family negotiations enhanced my leadership skills in ways that immediately translated to my museum work. 3 weeks after our initial agreement, we gathered at Walter's office for the formal signing of documents. The setting was deliberately neutral, neither Oak Ridge with its emotional resonance nor my father's firm, with its inherent power dynamics. Walter's conference room provided the professional environment this significant transition deserved. As we assembled around the polished mahogany table, I was struck by subtle changes in each family member's demeanor. My father, ever the attorney, maintained his formal exterior, but had abandoned the dismissive tone that had characterized many of our previous interactions. My mother watched me with a combination of newfound respect and lingering remorse. James had shifted from open hostility to grudging acknowledgement of my role, while Catherine had become an unexpected ally in hammering out practical compromises. Today represents an important transition for the Harrington family, Walter began, his formal tone appropriate for the occasion. These documents establish new governance structures for Oak Ridge while honoring both the letter and spirit of Harrison Harrington's trust. He distributed the final documents, bound in leather, portfolios embossed with the Harrington crest. The symbolic touch was Catherine's suggestion, a visual reminder that despite our differences, we remained connected by shared heritage. The key provisions are as follows, Walter continued. The Harrison Harrington Trust remains the legal owner of Oak Ridge, with Alexandra continuing as trustee. The newly established Harrington Family Foundation assumes financial responsibility for the estate's maintenance, taxes, and preservation efforts, with all adult family members serving as board members. My father nodded, his attorney's instincts satisfied by the clear delineation of responsibilities. The foundation structure had been his primary contribution to our compromise, allowing him to retain involvement in Oak Ridge's financial decisions, while creating tax advantages that addressed some of their ongoing financial challenges. James and Catherine will have lifetime occupancy rights to the East Wing, with significant latitude for interior renovations as outlined in Appendix B, which incorporates Dr. Blackwood's preservation recommendations. The historical public rooms will maintain their original character, with any modifications requiring approval from both the Family Council and preservation experts. James and Catherine exchanged glances, their satisfaction with this arrangement evident. The East Wing provisions gave them the freedom to create a modern living space for their family, while the overall framework ensured Oak Ridge's character would remain intact. Finally, Walter said, turning to a separate document, the acknowledgement of prior contributions formally recognizes Alexandra's financial support of Oak Ridge over the past decade, totaling $573,000. While this document doesn't create obligation for reimbursement, it establishes historical record of these contributions and their significance in preserving the Harrington legacy. This acknowledgement had been the most contentious element of our negotiations. My father had initially resisted formal recognition of my financial role, viewing it as implicit criticism of his management. My persistence on this point wasn't about embarrassing anyone, but about establishing truth as the foundation for our path forward. Before we sign, Walter said, does anyone wish to make amendments or express concerns about these final documents? A moment of silence followed. Not the tense silence of suppressed conflict, but the thoughtful quiet of consideration. My father finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured tone he typically reserved for important client meetings. These documents represent a fair compromise that serves our family's interests while respecting Harrison's intentions for Oak Ridge. Alexandra, he said, turning to me directly, your grandfather would be proud of how you've handled this situation. You've demonstrated both principle and pragmatism, qualities he valued highly. Coming from my father, this acknowledgement carried particular weight. He had spent decades competing with Grandfather Harrison's legacy, often feeling measured against his father-in-law's standards and found wanting. For him to invoke Harrison's approval of my actions suggested a significant shift in his own perspective. Thank you, I replied simply, recognizing the personal cost of his statement. These arrangements preserve what matters most about Oak Ridge, while creating space for new generations to make it their own. That balance was always Grandfather's vision. Walter guided us through the signing process, each signature representing not just legal commitment but personal investment in our new family framework. As I signed the final document, I felt a sense of completion that transcended the legal formalities. For the first time in years, our family was operating from a foundation of acknowledged truth rather than comfortable fictions. Following the signing, we gathered for lunch at Westfield's, my father's suggestion, breaking with his usual pattern of returning immediately to work after business meetings. This small gesture signaled his recognition that today's events warranted commemoration beyond legal formalities. As we settled at our table, my mother raised her water glass in an impromptu toast. To Oak Ridge, and to the Harrington family, moving forward together. We all joined the toast, the simple sentiment capturing our collective hope for the path ahead. The conversation that followed was notably different from our typical family interactions, more authentic, less performative. James shared genuine concerns about balancing preservation with creating a comfortable home for future children. My mother spoke candidly about her relief that Oak Ridge's financial stability was now assured. My father even acknowledged the wisdom of Grandfather Harrison's decision to establish the trust, though he admitted the secretive approach had created unnecessary complications. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.